Part 3, The Old Guard and the New Order. I have never taken an apprentice. I simply never felt compelled to subject another human being to our way of life. I often wonder what motivates other Scythes to do so. For some, it is a form of vanity. Learn from me and be awed because I am so wise. For others, perhaps, it is compensation for not being allowed to have children. Be my son or my daughter for a year, and I will give you power over life and death. Yet for others, I imagine it is to prepare for their own self-gleaning. Be the new me, so that the old me can leave this world satisfied. I suspect, however, if I ever take on an apprentice, it will be for a different reason entirely. From the Gleaning Journal of H.S. Curie, Chapter 18, Falling Water. As the far eastern edge of mid-America, near the East America border, was a home with a river running beneath it, spilling from its foundations into a waterfall. It was designed by a very well-known mortal-age architect, Scythe Curie told Citra as she led the way across the footbridge to the front door. The place has fallen into disrepair, as you can imagine. A home such as this couldn't survive without constant attention. It was in a horrible state, and no one cared enough to preserve it. Only the presence of a scythe would bring forth the kind of donations required to save it. Now it's been returned to its former glory. The scythe opened the door and let Citra step in first. "Welcome to Falling Water," Scythe Curie said. The main floor was a huge open room with a polished stone floor, wood furniture, a large fireplace, and windows. Lots and lots of windows. The waterfall was right beneath an expansive terrace. The sound of the river running beneath the home and over the falls was a constant but calming white noise. "I've never been in a house with a name," Citra said as she looked around, doing her best to be unimpressed. "But it's a bit much, isn't it? Especially for a scythe. Aren't you all supposed to live simple lives?" Citra knew such a comment could bring forth the scythe's temper, but she didn't care. Her presence here meant that Scythe Faraday died for nothing. A beautiful home was no consolation. Scythe Curie did not respond in anger. She just said, "I live here because of its extravagance, but because my presence here is the only way to preserve it." The decor seemed to be frozen in the 20th century when the place was built. The only hints of modernization were a few simple computer interfaces in unobtrusive corners. Even the kitchen was a throwback to an earlier time. "Come, I'll show you to your room." They climbed a staircase that was lined on the left by layered sheets of granite and echoed on the right by rows and rows of shelved books. The second floor was the scythe's bedroom suite. The third floor held a smaller bedroom and a study. The bedroom was simply furnished, and like the rest of the home, had huge windows framed in polished cedar, wrapping around 2 entire walls. The view of the forest made Citra feel as if she were perched in a treehouse. She liked it, and she hated that she did. "You know that I don't want to be here," Citra said. "At least some honesty from you," Scythe Curie said with the slightest of grins. "And," added Citra, "I know you don't like me, so why did you take me on?" The scythe looked at her with those cold, inscrutable gray eyes. "Whether or not I like you is irrelevant," she said. "I have my reasons." Then she left Citra alone in her room without as much as a goodbye. Citra didn't remember falling asleep. She hadn't even considered how exhausted she was. She recalled lying down on the comforter, looking out at the trees, listening to the river roaring endlessly below, wondering if the noise would eventually go from soothing to unbearable. And then she opened her eyes to stark incandescence, squinting at Scythe Curie, who was standing in the doorway by the light switch. It was dark outside now, not just dark but lightless, like space. She could still hear the river, but couldn't see even a hint of the trees. "Did you forget about dinner?" Scythe Curie asked. Citra rose, ignoring the sudden vertigo when she stood. "You could have woken me." Scythe Curie smirked. "I thought I just did." Citra made her way down to the kitchen, but the scythe let her go first, and she couldn't quite remember the way. The house was a maze. She took a few wrong turns, and Scythe Curie didn't correct her. She just waited for Citra to find her way. What, Citra wondered, would this woman want to eat? Would she silently accept anything that Citra prepared as Scythe Faraday had? The thought of the man brought a wave of sorrow, chased by anger, but she didn't know who exactly to be angry at, so it just festered. Citra arrived on the main floor, ready to assess the contents of the pantry and refrigerator, but to her surprise she found the dinner table set for 2, and steaming plates of food already there. "I had a hankering for Hassenpfeffer," the scythe said. "I think you'll like it." "I don't even know what Hassenpfeffer is." "Best if you don't." Scythe Curie sat down and bade Citra to do the same, but Citra wasn't quite ready, still wondering if this might be a trick. Scythe Curie dug a spoon into the rich stew, but paused when she saw Citra still standing. "Are you waiting for a formal invitation?" she asked. Citra couldn't tell if she was irritated or amused. "I'm an apprentice. Why would you cook for me? I didn't. I cooked for me. Your grumbling stomach just happened to be in the vicinity. Finally, Citra sat and tasted the stew. Flavorful, a little gamey, but not bad. The sweetness of honey-glazed carrots cut the gaminess. The life of a scythe would be dreadful if we didn't allow ourselves the guilty pleasure of a hobby. Mine is cooking. This is good, Citra admitted, then added, thank you. They ate mostly in silence. Citra felt odd not being of service at the table, so she got up to refill the Scythe's glass of water. Scythe Faraday did not have any hobbies, or at least none that he shared with Citra and Rowan. The thought of Rowan made her hand tremble as she poured, and she sloshed some water on the table. I'm sorry, Scythe Curie. She grabbed her own napkin and blotted the spill before it could spread. You'll need a steadier hand than that if you're going to be a scythe. Again, Citra couldn't tell if she was being serious or sardonic. The woman was even harder for Citra to read than Faraday, and reading people was not her forte by any means. Of course, she never realized this until she spent time with Rowan, who, in his own unobtrusive way, was a master of observation. Citra had to remind herself that she had other skills, speed and decisiveness of action, coordination. Those things would have to come into play if she was going to... She couldn't finish the thought, wouldn't allow herself to. The territory where that thought led was still too terrible to consider. In the morning, Scythe Curie made blueberry pancakes, and then they went out gleaning. While Scythe Faraday always reviewed his notes on his chosen subject and used public transportation, Scythe Curie had an old-school sports car that required substantial skill to drive, especially on a winding mountain road. This Porsche was a gift from an antique car dealer, Scythe Curie explained to her. He wanted immunity? Citra asked, assuming the man's motive. On the contrary, I had just gleaned his father, so he already had immunity. Wait, said Citra, you gleaned his father and he gave you a car? Yes. So he hated his father? No, he loved his father very much. Am I missing something? The road ahead of them straightened out. Scythe Curie shifted gears and they accelerated. He appreciated the solace I afforded him in the aftermath of the gleaning, she told Citra. True solace can be worth its weight in gold. Still, Citra didn't quite understand, and wouldn't until much later that evening. They went to a town that was hundreds of miles away, arriving around lunchtime. Some scythes prefer big cities. I prefer smaller towns, Scythe Curie said. Towns that perhaps haven't seen a gleaning in over a year. Who are we gleaning? Citra asked as they looked for a parking place, one of the liabilities of taking a car off-grid. You'll find out when it's time to know. They parked on a main street, then strolled down the street, which was busy but not bustling. Scythe Curie's leisurely pace made Citra uncomfortable, and she wasn't sure why. Then it occurred to her that when she went gleaning with Scythe Faraday, his focus was always on the destination, and that destination wasn't a place, but a person, the subject, the soul to be gleaned. As awful as that was, it had somehow made Citra feel more secure. With Scythe Faraday, there was always a tangible end to the endeavor, but nothing about Scythe Curie's manner suggested premeditation at all, and there was a reason for that. Be a student of observation, Curie told Citra. If you want a student of observation, you should have chosen Rowan. Scythe Curie ignored that. Look at people's faces, their eyes, the way they move. What am I looking for? A sense that they've been here too long, a sense that they're ready to conclude, whether they know it or not. I thought we weren't allowed to discriminate by age. It's not about age, it's about stagnation. Some people grow stagnant before they turn their first corner. For others, it could take hundreds of years. Citra looked at the people moving around them, all trying to avoid eye contact and get away from the scythe and her apprentice as quickly as possible, all the while trying not to be obvious about it. A couple stepping out of a cafe, a businessman on his phone, a woman beginning to cross the street against the light, then coming back, perhaps fearing that jaywalking would get her gleaned. I don't see anything in anyone, Citra said, irritated at both the task and her inability to rise to it. A group of people came out of an office building. Perhaps the tallest one in town was about 10 stories. Scythe Curie zeroed in on one man. Her eyes looked almost predatory as she and Citra began to follow him at a distance. Do you see how he holds his shoulders as if there is an invisible weight upon them? No. Can you see how he walks, a little less intently than those around him? No. Do you notice how scuffed his shoes are, as if he doesn't care anymore? Maybe he's just having a bad day, suggested Citra. Yes, maybe, admitted Scythe Curie, but I choose to believe otherwise. They closed in on the man, who never seemed to be aware that he was being stalked. All that remains is to see his eyes, the scythe said, to be sure. Scythe Curie touched him on the shoulder. He turned, and their eyes met, but only for a slight moment. Then he suddenly gasped, because Scythe Curie's blade had already been thrust up beneath his ribcage and into his heart. So quick was Scythe Curie that Citra never saw her do it. She never even saw the scythe pull out her blade. The scythe offered no response to the man's awful surprise. She said nothing to him at all. She just withdrew the blade, and the man fell. He was dead before he hit the pavement. Around them, people gasped and hurried around, but not so far away that they couldn't watch the aftermath. Death was unfamiliar to most of them. It needed to exist in its own bubble, as long as they could stay just beyond its outer edge, peering in. The scythe wiped her blade on a cloth, the same pale lavender as her robe, and that's when Citra lost control. "You gave him no warning," she blurted. "How could you do that? You don't even know him. You don't even let him prepare." The cloud of rage that billowed forth from Scythe Curie was so powerful it was almost like a visible thing, and Citra knew she had made a terrible mistake. "On the ground!" yelled the scythe with such volume it echoed back and forth between the brick buildings of the street. Citra immediately got to her knees. "Face to the pavement now!" Citra compiled fear overcoming her fury. She splayed herself prostrate on the ground, her right cheek pressed against the pavement, which was searingly hot from the midday sun. Her view was now of the dead man, just a foot away, whose eyes were empty and yet staring into Citra's at the same time. How could dead eyes still stare? "You dare presume to tell me how to accomplish my task?" It seemed the world had frozen around them. "You will apologize for your insolence and be disciplined." "I'm sorry, Scythe Curie." At the mention of Scythe Curie's name, a murmur erupted among the bystanders. She was a legend everywhere. "Convince me!" "I'm truly sorry, Scythe Curie," Citra said louder, screaming it into the face of the dead man. "I will never disrespect you again. Get up." The scythe was no longer raging with earth-shaking wrath. Citra rose, furious at the weakness of her own legs, which shook beneath her, and the incontinence of her eyes, which spewed tears she wished would evaporate before Scythe Curie or any of the bystanders could see. The world-renowned Grande Dame of Death turned to stride away, and Citra followed in her wake, humbled, hobbled, wishing she could take the scythe's blade and stab it into the woman's back, and then furious at herself for wishing such a thing. They got into the car and pulled away from the curb. Only when they were about a block away did the scythe speak to Citra. "Now then, it will be your task to identify the man, find his immediate family, and invite them to Falling Water so that I may grant them immunity." She spoke without the slightest hint of the fury of just a moment ago. "What?" It was as if the scene on the street had never happened. Citra was completely caught off guard, a bit dizzy, as if the air had been sucked out of the car. "I have 48 hours to grant them immunity. I'd like them to gather at my home this evening." But back there, when you had me on the ground, yes? And you were so angry." Scythe Curie sighed. "There is an image to uphold, dear," she said. "You defied me in public, so I had no choice but to publicly put you in your place. In the future, you need to hold your opinions until we are alone." "So you're not angry?" The scythe considered the question. "I'm annoyed," she said. "But then I should have warned you what I was about to do. Your response was justified, and so was the consequence I levied." Even at the end of this emotional roller coaster, Citra had to admit that the scythe was right. There was a certain amount of decorum required of an apprentice. Another scythe might have exacted a punishment far worse. They circled back, and Scythe Curie let Citra off on a side street just a block from where the gleaning had occurred. She would have an hour to find the family and extend them the invitation. "And if he lives alone, both our jobs will be easy today," the scythe said. Citra wondered what about gleaning could possibly be easy. The man's name was Barton Breen. He had turned the corner many times, had fathered more than 20 children over the years, some of whom were now over a century old themselves. His current household consisted of his most recent wife and his 3 youngest children. These were the ones who would receive immunity from gleaning in 1 year. "What if they don't come?" Citra asked Scythe Curie on the way home. "They always come," the scythe told her. And she was right. They arrived a little after 8 in the evening, somber and shell-shocked. Scythe Curie had them kneel right at the door to kiss her ring, granting them immunity. Then she and Citra served them dinner which the scythe had prepared. Comfort food, pot roast, green beans, and garlic mashed potatoes. Clearly the family had no appetite, but they ate out of obligation. "Tell me about your husband," Scythe Curie asked, her voice gentle and sincere. The woman was reluctant to say much at first, but soon she couldn't stop telling the tale of her husband's life. Soon the kids joined in with their memories. The man quickly went from an anonymous subject on the street to an individual whose life even Citra now missed, although she had never known him. And Scythe Curie listened, truly listened, as if she were intent on memorizing everything they said. More than once her eyes moistened, reflecting the tears of the family, and then the scythe did the oddest thing. She produced from her robe the blade that had taken the man's life and set it down on the table. "You may take my life, if you like," she told the woman. The woman just stared at her, not understanding. "It's only fair," the scythe said. "I've taken away your husband, robbed your children of their father. You must despise me for it." The woman looked to Citra as if she might know what to do, but Citra only shrugged, equally surprised by the offer. But attacking a scythe is punishable by gleaning. Not if you have the scythe's permission. Besides, you've already received immunity. I promise there will be no retribution. The knife lay on the table between them, and Citra suddenly felt like the pedestrians on the gleaning, frozen just on the other side of some unthinkable event horizon. Scythe Curie smiled at the woman with genuine warmth. It's all right. If you strike me down, my apprentice will simply bring me to the nearest revival center, and in a day or two I'll be good as new. The woman contemplated the blade. The children contemplated their mother. Finally, the woman said, No, that won't be necessary. Scythe Curie removed the blade from sight. Well, in that case, on to dessert. And the family devoured the chocolate cake with a passion they hadn't shown for the rest of the meal, as if a great pall had been lifted. After they were gone, Scythe Curie helped Citra with the dishes. When you're a scythe, she told Citra, I'm sure you won't do things my way. You won't do things the way Scythe Faraday did either. You'll find your own path. It may not bring you redemption, it might not even bring you peace, but it will keep you from despising yourself. Then Citra asked a question she had asked before, but this time she suspected she might get an answer. Why did you take me on, Your Honor? The scythe washed a dish. Citra dried it, and finally Scythe Curie said the oddest thing. Have you ever heard of a sport called cockfighting? Citra shook her head. Back in the mortal age, unsavories would take two roosters, put them in a small arena, and watch them battle to the death, wagering on the outcome. That was legal? No, but people did it anyway. Life before the Thunderhead was a blend of bizarre atrocities. You weren't told this, but Scythe Goddard had offered to take both you and Rowan on. He offered to take both of us? Yes, and I knew it would only be so he could pit the two of you against each other for his own amusement, like a cockfight. So I intervened and offered to take you in order to spare you both Scythe Goddard's bloody arena. Citra nodded in understanding. She chose not to point out that they hadn't been spared the arena at all. They were still facing a mortal struggle. Nothing could change that. She tried to imagine what it would have been like to be Scythe Curie had Scythe Curie not stepped forward. The thought of not being separated from Rowan was tempered by the knowledge of whose hand they'd be under. She didn't even want to imagine how he was faring with Goddard. As this had turned into an evening of answers, Citra dared to ask the questions she had asked so inappropriately on the street before the man's body had even gone cold. Why did you glean that man today without warning? Didn't he deserve at least a moment of understanding before your blade? This time Scythe Curie was not offended by the question. Every scythe has his or her method. This happens to be mine. In the age of mortality, death would often come with no warning. It is our task to mimic what we have stolen from nature, and so that is the face of death I've chosen to recreate. My gleanings are always instantaneous and always public, lest people forget what we do and why we must do it. But what happened to the scythe who gleaned the president, the hero who went after corporate corruption that not even the Thunderhead could rout? I thought the Grande Dame of Death would always glean with greater purpose. A shadow seemed to pass over Scythe Curie's face, a ghost of some sorrow Citra couldn't even guess at. You thought wrong. If you've ever studied Mortal Age cartoons, you'll remember this one. A coyote was always plotting the demise of a smirking, long-necked bird. The coyote never succeeded. Instead, his plans always backfired. He would blow up or get shot or splat from a ridiculous height, and it was funny, because no matter how deadly his failure, he was always back in the next scene, as if there was a revival center just beyond the edge of the animation cell. I've seen human foibles that have resulted in temporary maiming or momentary losses of life. People stumble into manholes or hit by falling objects, trip into the paths of speeding vehicles, and when it happens, people laugh, because no matter how gruesome the event, that person, just like that coyote, will be back in a day or two as good as new and no worse or wiser for the wearer. Immortality has turned us into cartoons. From the Gleaning Journal of H.S. Curie. Chapter 19. A terrible thing to do. Citra wasn't sure what possessed her to bring up the questions she had been asked at Conclave. Perhaps it was the unexpected closeness she felt to Scythe Curie after seeing her feed the grieving family and truly listen to the stories about the man she had gleaned. That night, Scythe Curie came into Citra's room with clean sheets. They made her bed together, and just as they finished, Citra said, In Conclave you accused me of lying. You were, Scythe Curie said. How did you know? Scythe Curie didn't offer a smile, but she didn't offer any judgment either. When you've lived nearly 200 years, some things are obvious. She tossed Citra a pillow, and Citra stuffed it into a pillowcase. I didn't push that girl down the stairs, Citra said. I suspected as much. Citra now clutched the pillow. As if it were alive, she would have suffocated it. I didn't push her down the stairs, Citra repeated. I pushed her in front of a speeding truck. Citra sat down, turning away from Scythe Curie. She couldn't look the woman in the face, and now she regretted having confessed this dark secret of her childhood. If the Grande Dame of Death sees you as a monster, what a monster you must truly be. What a terrible thing to do, said the Scythe, but her voice was even, not shocked. Was she killed? Instantly, Citra admitted. Of course, she was back in school 3 days later, but it didn't change what I had done, and the worst thing was no one knew. People thought she had tripped, and the other kids were laughing, because you know how funny it is when someone gets deadish by accident. But it wasn't an accident, and no one knew. No one saw me do it, and when she came back, she didn't even know. Citra forced herself to look at the grand dame of death, who now sat in a chair across the room from her, gazing at Citra with those invasive gray eyes. You asked me the worst thing I've ever done, Citra said. Now you know. Scythe Curie didn't speak right away. She just sat there letting the moment linger. Well, Scythe Curie finally said, going to have to do something about that. Rhonda Flowers was in the middle of a mid-afternoon snack when the doorbell rang. She didn't think anything of it until a few moments later when she looked up to see her mother standing at the kitchen threshold with a look of such abject pain on her face it was clear that something was very wrong. They want to see you, her mother announced. Rhonda slurped the ramen noodles they were dangling from her mouth and got up. Who's they? Her mother didn't answer. Instead, she threw her arms around Rhonda, giving her a bone-crushing hug, and melted into sobs. Then over her mother's shoulder, Rhonda saw them. A girl about her age, and a woman in a lavender garment, clearly in the style of a Scythe's robe. Be brave, her mother whispered desperately into Rhonda's ear, but bravery was about as far away as terror. There simply wasn't enough time to summon either fortitude or fear. All Rhonda felt was a sudden tingling in her extremities and a dreamy disconnect, as if she were watching a scene from somebody else's life. She left her mother and moved towards the door where the two figures waited. You want to see me? The Scythe, a woman with silky silver hair and a steely gaze, smiled. Rhonda never considered that a Scythe might smile. On the rare occasions she'd encountered them, she'd always seemed so somber. I don't, but my apprentice does, the woman said, indicating the girl. But Rhonda couldn't take her eyes off the Scythe. Your apprentice is going to glean me? We're not here for gleaning, said the girl. Only after hearing that did the terror Rhonda should have felt finally blossom. Her eyes filled with tears that she quickly wiped away as relief followed on terror's tail. You could have told my mother that. She turned and called to her mother. It's okay, they're not here to glean. Then she stepped aside, pulling the door closed beside her, knowing if she didn't, her mother would eavesdrop on whatever this was about. She had heard that traveling Scythes would show up at people's doors asking for shelter and food for the night, or sometimes they needed information from people for reasons she could only guess at. But why would they specifically want to speak to her? You probably don't remember me, said the girl, but we used to go to school together years ago before you moved here. As Rhonda studied the girl's face, she put forth the vaguest memory and tried to grasp at a name. Cindy something, right? Citra Terranova. Oh, right. And then the moment became awkward, as if standing on the porch with the Scythe and her apprentice wasn't awkward enough already. So, what can I do for you, your honors? She wasn't sure if apprentice warranted the title of your honor, but it couldn't hurt to err on the side of respect. Now that she had time to let her face and name sink in, Rhonda didn't remember much about Citra. As she recalled, they didn't like each other very much. Well, here's the thing, said Citra. Do you remember that day when you fell in front of that truck? Rhonda gave an involuntary shift of her shoulders. Like I could possibly forget it after I got back from the revival center. Everybody called me Rhonda Roadkill for months. Getting run over by a truck was perhaps the most annoying thing that ever happened to her. She was deadish for 3 whole days and ended up missing every last performance of her dance recital. The other girls said they did fine without her, which just made it worse. The only good thing about it was the food at the revival center on the day she became conscious. They had the best homemade ice cream. So good that she once splattered just to get another taste of it. But of course, leave it to her parents to send her to a cheapo revival center with sucky food. So you were there when it happened? Well, here's the thing, Citra said for the second time. Then she took a deep breath and said, it wasn't an accident. I pushed you. Ha! Said Rhonda. I knew it. I knew someone pushed me. At the time, her parents had tried to convince her that it was unintentional, that someone had bumped her. Eventually, she came to believe it, but in the back of her mind, she always held on to a little bit of doubt. So it was you. Rhonda found herself smiling. There was victory in knowing that she hadn't been crazy all those years. Anyway, I'm sorry, Citra said. I'm really, really sorry. So why are you telling me now? Well, here's the thing, Citra repeated like it was a nervous tick. Being a Scythe's apprentice means I have to make amends for my past bad actions. And so, I want to give you the chance to do the same thing to me. She cleared her throat. I want you to push me in front of a truck. Rhonda guffawed at the suggestion. She didn't mean to. It just came out. Really? You want me to throw you in front of a speeding truck? Yes. Right now? Yes. And your Scythe is okay with that. The Scythe nodded. I support Citra entirely. Rhonda considered the proposal. She supposed she could. How many times in her life had she wanted to dispose of somebody, even if just temporarily? Just last year, she had come remarkably close to accidentally executing her lab partner in science because he was such an ass. But in the end, she realized that he'd get a few days' vacation and she'd have to finish the lab alone. The situation was different. It was a free revenge ticket. The question was, how badly did she want revenge? Listen, it's tempting and all, said Rhonda, but I've got homework and dance class later, so you don't want to? It's not that I don't want to. I'm just busy today. Can I throw you under a truck some other time? Citra hesitated. Okay. Or better yet, maybe you can just take me out to lunch or something. Okay. Just next time, please give us some warning so you don't freak out my mother. Then she said goodbye, stepped inside, and closed the door. How bizarre, said Rhonda. What was that all about, her mother asked. And since she didn't want to get into it, Rhonda said nothing important, which irritated her mother, just as it was intended to do. Then she went back into the kitchen, where she found her ramen had gotten cold. Great. Citra felt both relieved and humiliated at once. For years she had held on to this secret crime. Her gripe with Rhonda had always been petty, as most childhood resentments are. It was the way Rhonda always spoke of her dancing, as if she was the most talented ballerina in the world. Citra was in the same dance class back in that magical childhood time when little girls nurtured the delusion that they were as graceful as they were cute. Rhonda had led the pack in disabusing Citra of that delusion through eyeball rolls and exasperated exhales each time Citra took an imperfect step. The push wasn't premeditated, it was a crime of opportunity, and that one act had cast a shadow over Citra that she hadn't even realized until she faced the girl today. And Rhonda didn't even care. It was water under a very old bridge. Citra felt stupid about the whole thing now. You realize that in the age of mortality, you would have been treated much differently. Scythe Carey didn't look at her as she spoke. She never looked away from the road while she was driving. Citra was still getting used to this odd habit. How strange to actually have to see the path of your journey in order to make it. If it was the age of mortality, I wouldn't have done it, Citra said with confidence, because I'd know she wouldn't be back. Pushing her then would have been more like gleaning. They had a word for it, murder. Citra chuckled at the archaic word. That's funny, like a bunch of crows. I'm sure it wasn't funny at the time. She did a quick maneuver to avoid a squirrel on the winding road. Then Scythe Carey took a rare moment to glance at Citra when the road straightened. So now the penance you've given yourself is to be a scythe, forever doomed to take punishment for that one childhood act. I didn't give it to myself, didn't you? Citra opened her mouth to answer, but then stopped, because what if Scythe Carey was right? What if deep down Citra had accepted the apprenticeship with Scythe Faraday to punish herself for the crime only she cared about? If so, it was an unusually harsh judgment. Had she been caught or had she confessed, her punishment would have been a short suspension from school at most, plus a fine for her parents and a stern reprimand. It would even have been an upside. Her schoolmates would have been afraid to cross her. The difference between you and most other people, Citra, is that other people would not have cared about that girl once revived. They would have simply forgotten about it. Scythe Faraday saw something in you when he chose you, perhaps the weight of your conscience. And then she added, it was the same weight that led me to know that you were lying in conclave. I'm actually surprised the Thunderhead didn't see me push her, Citra said offhandedly. Then the Scythe said something that began a chain reaction in Citra's mind that changed everything. I'm sure it did, she said. The Thunderhead sees just about everything, what with cameras everywhere, but it also decides what infractions are worth the effort to address and which ones are not. The Thunderhead sees just about everything. And had a record of practically every human interaction since the moment it became aware, but unlike in mortal days, that knowledge was never abused. Before the Thunderhead achieved consciousness, when it was merely known as the Cloud, criminals and even public agencies would find ways into people's private doings against the law and exploit that information. Every school child knew of the information abuses that nearly brought down civilization before the Thunderhead condensed into power. Since that time, there had not been a single breach of personal information. People waited for it. People prophesied doom at the hands of a soulless machine, but apparently the machine had a purer soul than any human. It watched the world from millions of eyes, listened from millions of ears. It either acted or chose not to act on the countless things it perceived, which meant that somewhere in its memory lurked a record of Scythe Faraday's movement on the day his life ended. Citra knew it was probably a pointless endeavor to track those movements, but what if Faraday's demise was not an act of self-blaming at all? What if he was pushed, just as Citra had pushed Rhonda all those years ago? But this wouldn't have been a childish crime of the moment. It would have been cruelly premeditated. What if Faraday's death was, to use the word Scythe Carey had taught her, murder? As a young man, I marvel at the stupidity and hypocrisy of the mortal age. In those days, the purposeful act of ending human life was considered the most heinous of crimes. How ridiculous. I know how hard it is to imagine that what is now humanity's highest calling was once considered a crime. How small-minded and hypocritical mortal man was. For even as they despised the enders of life, they loved nature, which in those days took every life ever conceived. Nature deemed that to be born with an automatic sentience to death, and then brought about that death with vicious constancy. We changed that. We are now a force greater than nature. For this reason, science must be loved as a glorious mountain vista, as revered as a redwood forest, and as respected as an approaching storm. From the Gleaning Journal of H.S. Goddard.